What landing spots should fantasy football managers be keeping an eye on heading into the 2026 offseason?
What? Why are you shaking your head?
You're welcome.
Fantasy Football Daily with Theo Gremminger on the Fantasy Points Podcast Network and Fantasy Points YouTube. Dave, oftentimes we focus in on like the early rankings, but if we take a step back, there's some massive ADP driver landing spots. Every year, the market sort of moves when a guy lands into a dream spot. This year, we've circled quite a few of them to go over. Your thoughts on this kind of an exercise early in the offseason?
Well, we're just so far ahead of the market here, Theo. We already did our way too early rankings like a month ago, so we don't want to do that again. So we're doing something different. And this is the time of year where, like, of course, I love watching playoff football. Like, there's nothing more exciting than playoff football. But I do like kind of, Jeff Bell and I talk about this a lot on our show, is just kind of laying the foundation for the offseason. It's a lot of speculating, just kind of getting the gears turning in your head, like, oh, this player would make sense with this team, and this coach would make sense with this team, and trying to put the pieces together before we get the full picture. So I love this part of the offseason, just trying to get ahead of what could potentially happen.
Yeah, and we're talking about variables on top of variables on top of variables. We're going to talk about a lot of teams today that don't even have a head coach, that don't even have an offensive coordinator. We of course don't know which direction a lot of these teams are going to go in the NFL draft. And there's just so much going on, so many spinning wheels. But again, we're looking to identify these ADP driver positions where players signs there, players traded there, players drafted there, that ADP shoots up. We've got a couple of obvious ones and a couple of under the radar ones. Why don't we first talk about quarterback? Yesterday's news, we're recording this today on Thursday, and on Wednesday, Dante Moore of Oregon announced that he was heading back to college. So it's a very small QB class. There's a couple of guys who could drive their way into the first round consideration. We still got to see what's going on with like Trinidad Chambliss of Ole Miss, a couple of guys like that, Ty Simpson, but really Fernando Mendoza locked and loaded, going near the 101, if not the 101. Then, Dave, we've got all these quarterback-needy teams and all these guys who could be moving directions. What's your favorite quarterback landing spot this year, a landing spot that would get you really excited?
This might be like one of the hottest takes that I have right now, so we're just like jumping off the top rope straight from the jump here. But the Arizona Cardinals, there's been a lot of buzz about them moving on from Kyler Murray. We have just seen now, like, they have tried with Kyler Murray, and the tools are still there, and he still makes these exciting highlight reel plays, but he just hasn't really grown and developed the way that they had hoped. Like, they drafted him to be this toolsy player. He's still the same toolsy player that he was his rookie season and hasn't really taken a step forward. So we've heard a lot of buzz about them potentially releasing him, just taking that cap hit on the chin and moving on. They can do that. They've got a lot, about $44 million in cap space right now. I also think that he could potentially end up getting traded. The Jets, the Dolphins, or some teams out there that make some sense. I think if that spot does become available, they don't want to go out with Jacoby Brissett. Like, Jacoby Brissett was fun in fantasy, but at the end of the day, he wasn't winning games. So I see this team with $44 million in cap space, with Trey McBride, with Marvin Harrison Jr., with Michael Wilson finally breaking out this year, with a strong corral of running backs. They could shore up the offensive line a little bit, but I think this could be a really, really fun offense if you drop a good quarterback into it.
I love that one. It's because of the skill position talent that's there. And with Jacoby Brissett, we saw him finish as a QB1 in like all but one start this year. He was locked and loaded. The power of Trey McBride, the power of Michael Wilson / Marvin Harrison Jr. There's some stuff there that this could be a quarterback steps in and puts up better than anticipated numbers. For me, I'm going to go with one that nobody's going to like. I'm going to have like a lot of like WTF faces out there. Listen to this one, Dave. Miami Dolphins for me. And it's simply because there's panic mode with a number of fantasy managers that Devon Achane's like production is going to take a step back without Mike McDaniel there. I'll take the opposite approach. I think Etienne is talented enough that if we get a little bit of stability here at the quarterback position, maybe more trips to the red zone, maybe a guy like Malik Willis ends up in Miami, we could get super excited about that one. Jalen Waddle's a player that I know you're very enthusiastic about, really for the same reason. But those two players, I think that there's a potential for you to make dynasty trades for them right now. And I'll be interested to see sort of the initial ADP for Devon Achane once we start really drafting. And I'll tell you what, Dave, if it's anywhere near like the 1-2 turn because of trepidation in the market, then that's an auto-click pick. Probably should be more closely ranked in ADP, somewhere around that 5-6 area in the first round. So for me, it's the Miami Dolphins because we have a very, very strong running back who can also catch passes. We have a wide receiver who's had fantasy success already in place. Maybe we get a more stable offensive environment, offensive ecosystem, and maybe the head coach is going to surprise because I think a lot of people are fearful the offense could regress without Mike McDaniel's sort of genius in there. Your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I think it's a very desirable landing spot for a head coach. I mean, if I'm a head coach and I've got my choice between like playing like in a cold, wintry city or just like spending some time in Miami, I think that gives like the tiebreaker right there is that you just get to live in Miami. But on top of that, talking about a quarterback getting dropped into that system, they have a very underrated pass blocking unit as well. Our Matt Batanti, he does a great job with offensive line rankings. He's not too high on the run blocking unit or the run blocking from this unit, but he's got them as the 9th overall pass blocking. So there was so much concern about Tua taking sacks, but it wasn't the amount of sacks he was taking. It wasn't the pressure that was getting on him. It was just that when he would go down, he'd suffer these concussions that would knock him out. So I think that there's a lot of fear about the offensive line there, but it's a better than people realize offensive line. So you've got a good offensive line, good running backs, good wide receiver. They'll have to shed some money. They're sitting like 17 million above the salary cap right now. So they'll have to make some moves this offseason and some surprise cuts could be imminent. But yeah, that's a good landing spot for both a coach and a quarterback, I believe.
So I did this as a thread on X the other day where I sort of spitballed some of these landing spots, but without giving a player speculation, but just sort of the general ADP mover. For today's show, Dave and I are also going to share a potential player landing in this spot. And for some of these spots, we could talk about maybe the team doesn't do anything. Maybe a player just gets an elevated role. Maybe a player just gets re-signed. But Dave, I think we could both agree there's two really cool wide receiver landing spots that I think fantasy managers are going to go absolutely nuts for. Number one for me, Buffalo Bills wide receiver 1. You talk about Buffalo winning in Jacksonville in the wild card round, despite using guys like Tyrell Shavers, Brandon Cooks, Khalil Shakir dominating the target share. Like Shakir's a solid NFL player, but he acted as a de facto wide receiver 1. Keon Coleman, a pretty disastrous pickup. Josh Palmer, they didn't get anything out of as a free agent this past offseason. So I think there's a lot of pressure on the front office. What way do you think Buffalo goes this offseason, and who's a player that you think could land in this position?
You know, we talked about this guy yesterday on my show, which thank you for coming on. You know, you and I collaborate a lot in the offseason.
The launching pad. If you're listening to Fantasy Football Daily, go ahead and subscribe to the launching pad. It's absolute fire from Dave. Fantastic stuff there. An incredible guest. You guys have incredible guests on, Dave.
Yes. Thank you very much. And it was actually supposed to come out Friday, but with the Dante Moore news already aging that episode, I just pushed it out this morning. So you can check that one out a day early if you want to. But Alec Pierce in Buffalo, tell me this doesn't make so much sense. It's the exact type of guy that they need, and it's a guy that they've been searching for years with Gabe Davis. You know, they hope that he could be that downfield threat, the playmaking guy who could pull contested catches deep downfield. They tried with Keon Coleman. They tried with Brandon Cooks being that field stretcher this year. And you make a good point that Khalil Shakir, I think, is a very underrated football player, but he is limited in what he can do. He plays that slot role. He likes catching balls across the middle of the field where he can create after the catch. But what you need is kind of this high-low offense. And we see all of the best offenses in football have this, and they don't have that deep threat. And to me, when your quarterback is Josh Allen, one of the best deep ball throwers in the NFL, a guy with just a howitzer for an arm, not having a guy that can threat vertically makes no sense whatsoever. So Alec Pierce is going to get a big payday this year, and I would love if it comes from Buffalo.
Yeah, I love it too. And Alec Pierce is a player that I think is a no-brainer ad for any dynasty manager. And if you're doing early drafts, just draft him because he's going to get an absolute fortune in the free agent market. You have brought up to me that Indianapolis, you think there's going to be a push from the organization to re-sign him there. I do think that if he's out on the open market, Buffalo would make total sense. He's also super appealing to teams where we see players get a little bit more in the free agent market where they're in that age sweet spot. So if you're like a 25-year-old, 26-year-old wide receiver and you enter the open market, you're going to get more than maybe a bigger name historically that might happen to be 29. It just makes total sense. You're buying into a player that might give you a longer shelf life there. So I think Alec Pierce Pierce, if he ends up as a Buffalo Bill, I mean, you're talking about a player that probably steams up into like the 5th, 6th round by the end of the summer with people getting excited about that profile. I'll also throw out Mike Evans, I think will be a real possibility. Mike Evans is going to be ring chasing. It's a shorter shelf life type signing for Buffalo, but Mike Evans, if he really wants to go chase a ring, go to Buffalo, play with Josh Allen for a season, maybe 2. Mike Evans still looked like he was playing at a very high level. I mean, these guys like Devontae Adams and Mike Evans, they don't age the same way as some of these other wide receivers, Dave. But I'll tell you the player that I think Buffalo ultimately ends up with. And I think it's going to take a little bit of maneuvering in the NFL draft. They're going to have to probably move up about 10 spots. But I think that the Buffalo Bills are going to ultimately draft Makai Lemon out of USC, who's a player that I know you're very, very high on, that I think fantasy managers are going to be way more high on than maybe some NFL teams. He's not as clean cut of a prospect as like a Carnell Tate or a Jordan Tyson. Makai Lemon projects as a player who, I mean, your ultimate like dream outcome for him, if you're a believer, is like an Amon-Ra St. Brown. We remember where Amon-Ra St. Brown fell to in the NFL draft. Lemon's not going to do that. Lemon will be somewhere in like the top 30 picks, but I think it's right in the wheelhouse. And you talk about a sure-handed, excellent route runner that can be moved all over, that can dominate in the slot. I think this is a player that could cook with Josh Allen. I think he'd be the number 1 target. I think he'd be 135 targets right out of the gate. Would be a terrific Buffalo Bill.
You know, I do love that. I think that there's some overlapping skill sets, and we get so, like, we talk about the overlapping skill sets all the time, but we just saw the Seahawks go with JSN and Cooper Kupp. Like, I don't think that matters as much to NFL teams as it does to us when we're talking about it. I do worry that would kind of squeeze Khalil Shakir out a little bit. You talked about Mike Evans, and that was the first guy that popped into my mind. Me saying Alec Pierce is definitely wish casting, because this would be the best case scenario for Josh Allen and the Buffalo Bills and for Alec Pierce. But I do think the first guy you mentioned, Mike Evans, probably makes the most sense just from what we've seen historically from this Buffalo team. Bringing in Brandon Cooks this year, bringing in Amari Cooper last year. They do have a type, and it seems to be these high pedigree wide receivers that are over the age hill. So I think that, you know, Mike Evans would make sense. Tyreek Hill, if he's able to clear physically, he might make some sense as well. But, you know, Makai Lemon would be a ton of fun. Alec Pierce would be a ton of fun. And I think we're doing a little bit of wish casting here by talking about those guys in that spot.
1,000,000%. A lot of this is going to be wish casting, but that's what makes it so much fun. Dave, let everybody know what you're working on this time of year. What do you want people to check out?
Oh, man, real simple. I'm over at Football Guys exclusively. So shows, articles, podcasts, YouTube, rankings, all that sort of stuff. I've got the Dynasty show that I'm doing with Jeff Bell right now. I've got the Launchpad, which you were just a guest on yesterday. So be sure to check that episode out. And then we'll be launching the Fantasy Football show again in just about a month. We take a little bit of break after the season, but that'll be up and running again in no time. And then, of course, just nonstop articles. We've got the rookie guide coming out as well. So it's funny. A lot of people think this is the time of year that we get to unplug. I've had so many family members and friends like, hey, congratulations, you made it through the season. And I'm like, Dynasty and draft season is here. It never really stops.
Yeah, you know, we don't get to unplug, but we do have a little more flexibility. I'll say that. It's kind of nice where I know for me, where I'm doing all the waiver wire content and stuff like that, I don't have to worry about that. But yeah, there's no off season. I go to Mobile, and then we're sort of in NFL draft season. You're recording like 18 podcasts a week over there. So it's very, very fun. But the grind never stops. And I think it's the same for fantasy football managers, where people are drafting competitively way early on. All of these underdog contests that they drop in the offseason fill. Like, I know a lot of the pre-draft stuff, it's a wild sport. Everybody loves it. We love fantasy football, and we're going to bring you the best content we possibly can. And a ton of respect for you, Dave, what you're doing over at Football Guys. You're grinding it out, and it's all easy to listen to and highly actionable content you're dropping. Let's talk about the New England Patriots here. This was a team that nearly earned the one seed in the AFC. They've got a home game against the Houston Texans coming up. Again, we're recording this on Thursday. They got a lot out of Stephon Diggs on a per-game basis, but Stephon Diggs at 32 years old, no one would call the long-term answer. When you talk about cap space, New England's also in a good spot right now. Draft-wise, they're going to be picking at the tail end of the first round. What way do you think that they go with their wide receiver position this year in the 2026 offseason?
I think they're going to run it back, and I know that's the boring answer here. There is some cap relief if they move on from Stephon Diggs, but I think Stephon Diggs was good for them this year. He wasn't playing a full-time role, and a lot of that is because he's just a zero in the run blocking game. But when he was on the field, he was still one of the most efficient wide receivers out there on a per route run basis. So he's due a little bit more money next year. They signed him to this 3-year, $69 million contract. Only $17 million was guaranteed at signing, so they could move on from him this year. But I think having Stephon Diggs is that guy who is proven to help develop wide receivers, whether it was half a season with CJ Stroud or a few years with the Buffalo Bills or way back in his time with Kirk Cousins. He has been that safety blanket for a young wide receiver that helps elevate them to the next level. So it seems to me when you look at this team, Stephon Diggs is the clear wide receiver one, but I don't think that their secondary and tertiary receivers are bad. Like Kayshon Boutte is very good at stretching the field and making these highlight plays downfield. Demario Douglas took a little bit of a step back this year, but I still have faith in him being an above average slot player. And then, of course, Hunter Henry's still under contract there. We know that he is that other secondary safety blanket for Drake May. So they might add a day 3 wide receiver or kind of a lesser known veteran, but I don't expect any big splashy moves. I think we're going to see Stephon Diggs, Kayshon Boutte, Demario Douglas, and then, of course, Kyle Williams, who they're hoping to get bigger things from in year 2.
So I'll take an opposite approach. I think a lot of times teams, when they get this deep into the postseason, now, if New England wins a Super Bowl, maybe it's a more pragmatic approach like you're talking about. But if New England's going to get close enough to it with Drake May heading into year 3, I think there could be a push the chips in type move. Then we also talk about like a potential arms race where we've got in their division, the Buffalo Bills could potentially bring in 1 or 2 big name wide receivers. You talk about in the AFC as a whole, I think there'll be a significant market for a number of teams looking to like reshuffle things. Baltimore Ravens seem like an obvious one that are going to do something splashy this offseason to maximize that window of time that they have with Lamar Jackson playing with Derrick Henry, push the chips in type team there. So I think that the Patriots actually do push the chips in. I think back to connections to Mike Vrabel in Tennessee. I think back to what has this organization done historically. Names like Randy Moss, names like Corey Dillon, big name players from other teams. The team acquires them. They come into New England and they chase a ring. And I'm going to say this, A.J. Brown will be a New England Patriot. This is the trade to keep an eye on. Philly can trade him to New England. They get him out of the NFC. They could recoup something strong here. AJ buys himself like a nice 2-year window. Gonna be 29 years old for AJ Brown. He's got some high-level playing time left in him, and I think he'll end up being the number 1 target. And if there is a situation where they work things out and Diggs and him remain together, they can coexist there. Again, we mentioned guys like Kyle Williams. We mentioned guys like Kayshon Boutte, but AJ Brown's a different level of wide receiver there. A chance to get a true alpha, still kind of in his prime, close enough to his prime despite the struggles in the NFC playoffs against San Francisco. A.J. Brown, New England Patriot.
And I almost wonder if that's what A.J. Brown needs, because we saw him like just come out hair on fire when he was, in his earliest years at Tennessee. And then the effort started to wane a little bit. And then he was traded to Philadelphia, immediately established himself as one of the best wide receivers in the league. And then again, we see injuries starting to pile up, effort starting to wane a little bit. So I wonder if that's just what he needs, is like every 2 or 3 years, just trade A.J. Brown and get him reinvigorated. That would make a ton of sense. And you talk about them, bringing in some of these players with, I don't want to say character concerns, but maybe just like some question marks around them. Like you talked about Randy Moss, but I also remember like Ocho Cinco and Albert Haynesworth. And like they are not afraid to bring those guys in and hope that they adopt the Patriots way. So that's why I love doing these shows, Theo, where we are just kind of guessing as much as we can, because that's a thought that hadn't crossed my mind. There were those rumors going around a few months back, but kind of out of sight, out of mind with those rumors. And now I'll be daydreaming about A.J. Brown, the New England Patriots wide receiver.
I think that the fantasy community would get excited about that one. Another player that the fantasy community will get excited about is whoever lands in Dallas at the running back position. Now, Javonte Williams could be re-signed by the team. I think there'll be some mutual interest between both sides here. But Javonte Williams took a cheap deal to sign with Dallas, sort of a bet on himself type deal. Now he's going to be on the open market. I think there's going to be a market for Javonte Williams now that he shows he's fully healthy, maybe trending back a little bit explosiveness-wise to what we saw early on in his career in Denver. And Dallas is going to have to franchise tag George Pickens this offseason or really give him the bag. Dave, that's a whole nother show all unto itself. But Dallas has this reputation as a team that does crazy things at the running back position. And certainly they took Ezekiel Elliott extremely highly many years ago. But since then, it's been a Moneyball approach. Tony Pollard, they drafted on day 3, got a ton out of him before he left for Tennessee. Then Rico Dowdle, they ended up getting a 1,000-yard season out of. And then this year, Javonte Williams averaged 17.5 touches per game. Javonte, very strong production for what they paid for him. What do you think Dallas does this offseason with this open running back spot?
Simply put, exactly the opposite of what fantasy managers want. And you alluded to it. They have taken this Moneyball approach, and I think that Jared Jones was just so scorned by that Zeke contract that I don't expect him to make a splashy play for a running back. It just hasn't happened since Zeke. So they have found production there. They realize like the premium positions. They want a good offensive line. They want good wide receivers, and that makes the running back job easier. So I don't have an exact name here, but I think it's going to be a less than exciting signing. Looking at Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt and Jeremy McNichols, some of these guys that we can't get too excited about. I think the higher end, like if they do spend a little bit more than we expect, even that, it could be like a Kenneth Gainwell or Brian Robinson Jr. So I know we would love to see what Kenneth Walker or Travis Etienne or Breece Hall could look like in Dallas, but I'm just going to be the wet blanket in the room and say that I don't think that's the approach Dallas is going to take here.
Yeah, I think that Dallas, it's a wide range here. Dallas has a little more cap flexibility. They have more draft picks now. And I think Dallas, coming off of a season where they didn't make the playoffs, for better or for worse, I think they might be a little more aggressive at the running back position than in previous seasons. I'm going to go ahead and also say that the fact that there's if anybody wants a deeper dive into just the running back class and like potential running back moves, you and Jeff Bell dropped a really good podcast the other day. Make sure you check that one out over at Football Guys. But I think the fact that there's so many running backs available this offseason in free agency could end up creating some real bargains on the market.
Oh, yeah.
And maybe players not getting those big contracts. And when I say big contracts, I mean those longer term contracts. I think you might see more Javonte Williams type deals this offseason with players taking a short-term deal, get paid for a year, bet on yourself, then earn a little bit more next offseason where maybe the free agent market won't be quite as competitive. So I'm going to say Kenneth Walker, Dallas Cowboys. It makes a lot of sense. I think Walker is going to be very appealing to a lot of teams, but does that come out and equal into a huge contract? I think Walker is a player that fantasy managers might value more than some teams on the market, Dave, because you talked about it when we recorded together. It's the playing style for Walker where he's a home run hitter, but with the home run hitting ability, you've also got to accept that there's going to be certain games where he's going to lose some yardage in big situations. Also, the receiving ability, I think, will be appealing to Dallas. They used Javonte Williams in that role this year. So I think Walker, it makes a lot of sense for Walker to get into this premium role in Dallas with minimal competition behind him. Guys like Jaden Blue, Malik Davis, not the kind of running backs that could take away from him, gets into a situation where he's going to absorb a high number of touches. For better or for worse, bet on yourself type deal in Dallas.
Yeah, I mean, I would love that. I think that would be so much fun. And that's the type of stuff that would just like break fantasy Twitter if we get one of those. I'm kind of looking at Etienne, Walker, and Breece Hall as kind of the big three in this free agency class. And if one of those guys lands with Dallas, it's going to be a ton of fun. There are some good landing spots out there. And as much as I'd love to see it, I still think that there's going to be a market for those guys. But you talk about like just on a bigger scale, you talk about seeing a lot of these 1-year deals. And we see teams so willing to take that approach now where they will just do a 1-year deal with these running backs. And that's why every single offseason, it just seems like every running back ends up on a different team. Like you've got your guys that come into the league and they get their 3, 4, 5-year guaranteed contract, and they're going to stick with that team for 4 or 5 years. And then it just seems like every year they're bouncing around to a different city. So we don't see a lot of multi-year second contracts at this point. And if we do, it's usually built to be very team friendly where they can get out of it after a year or two. So I hope that some of these talented players will draw a little bit more interest, but these aren't Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, Christian McCaffrey type free agents. They're kind of a tier below where these guys were, and teams might just take that 1-2 year contract approach with them.
And I would say that the ironic move and the Moneyball approach could also be Dallas considering bringing back Rico Dowdle if both sides could come to an agreement. familiarity with playing with Dak Prescott, familiarity with being a Dallas Cowboy, and coming off of what we would call a successful year in Carolina. I think Dowdle is going to get paid by somebody. Let's do one more team here. Kansas City Chiefs. There's been a lot of talk by the beat reporters that this is a real transition offseason. We could talk about a lot of positions in Kansas City, but let's focus in on running back, because running back will be an ADP driver. A player gets a chance to play next to Patrick Mahomes in an Andy Reid offense, has a chance to shoot up in ADP value. And Dave, like, we've got to go back a few years, but Andy Reid used to have this reputation of being sort of a running back whisperer in his times in Philly, early in Kansas City. It's been sort of getting away from that one. Ever since like Jerick McKinnon and that 1 year of Isaiah Pacheco, we haven't seen the sort of running back production we're used to with an Andy Reid team. So I think the right player would have a chance to sort of flip the script there. Which way do you think that this team goes? I'll say that they're in the wheelhouse for Jeremiah Love in the draft. They're picking inside the top 10. But what way do you think they ultimately end up with who's starting at running back?
Well, my immediate reaction, I was like, put Breece Hall in Kansas City. Like, that's what everyone in the world wants to see until you look at it. And the Kansas City Chiefs have more money on the books than any other team. They're currently over $50 million above the salary cap. So they have to do a lot of maneuvering this offseason to get that number down. So we have seen that this is a team that tries to find talent on day three. And they found that for a couple of years with Isaiah Pacheco. You know, they kept going back to the well, trying with Darwin Thompson and Carson Steele and Deneric Prince and all of these other guys. I don't think this team is in a position where they can spend a lot of money on the running back. So when I look at it, as much as we would love to see one of these marquee free agents sign there, or you talk about a Jeremiah Love, I think would be so much fun. Outside of Patrick Mahomes, this team has so many holes to fill, and they're looking at Patrick Mahomes potentially not being ready for the start of the season, missing the early part of the season. So as not fun as it sounds, I think we're probably going to be looking at just a day three pick, maybe even 2 day three picks, probably bringing back Kareem Hunt, who knows the system, on near a veteran minimum deal. This team just has a lot of holes to fill right now, and they aren't a team that has really aggressively targeted the running back position. They've made it work with Darrell and Damian Williams and, Kareem Hunt on a rookie contract. They've always found ways to make it work without having to invest there. And given where the team is right now, I don't see them changing that philosophy. So, whoever it is, we talked ourselves into Carson Steele and Darwin Thompson, and this offseason, we're going to talk ourselves into Baraka Kapinu or whoever they take on day three. But the reality is they take this frustrating committee approach and they don't spend a lot of money there. And I don't think that they're going to change that this season.
So I think you're probably right that like a Travis Etienne ending up there is something that we're really hoping for rather than something that's more likely to happen. I do think that there's, again, if one of these running backs ends up on a short-term deal, do they take a deal from Kansas City that maybe is beneficial to both to get into a positive offensive ecosystem? But I'll say if they stay in the draft, I actually think that they draft a little bit earlier than we're used to with them. I think that there's a couple of appealing backs. I think at 40 overall, We've talked about Jeremiah Love a lot, but we could also talk about his teammate, and that's Jadarian Price, who I think ultimately is going to be the number 2 back off the board. A little bit more of a guy that you're projecting to be in a high-end committee approach, but Jadarian Price could be excellent in high-value touches, really an explosive back, and I think he could end up being a fantasy-friendly player. Looking at him in the second round, and then when we go into round 3, a player that I think there's going to be some pressure on at the Senior Bowl. People are going to want to see a positive performance there, but Jonah Coleman out of the University of Washington, built like a Doug Martin type back, like a thick running back that can also catch passes out of the backfield. Really a strong profile there. If he has a strong Senior Bowl and runs well, I think he's going to be a day 2 selection, probably falling into like that Caleb Johnson range that we saw last year inside of round 3. But I think Jonah Coleman is a fantasy-friendly profile that would fit well in this offense. So I'm looking at him inside of round 3, and then I'm also looking at Jadarian Price inside of round 2.
I'll throw one other name out there, a guy who I don't think is going to be a day two guy, probably will fall to day three, but really fits the archetype for the type of running backs and players that the Kansas City Chiefs have gone after. Desmond Reid from Pittsburgh. He is a very undersized guy, and I think that he was getting a lot more draft buzz 2 years ago. Dealt with some injuries last season that have pushed his stock down a little bit, but Andy Reid loves those versatile wide receivers. The guy that he can kick out wide, line up in the slot, the guy who can run crisp routes while also be a guy who can handle touches out of the backfield. So Desmond Reid would be another one that, if he ends up signing with the Chiefs and people watch his highlight reel, he will absolutely be getting drafted in round 18 of every single best ball draft this offseason.
Yeah, it's not an off season if we can't get really excited about a Chiefs rookie running back, is it?
Exactly.
It's an annual tradition for us in the fantasy community. All right, Dave, let's keep it going to the running back discussion. I mentioned Travis Etienne earlier. Travis Etienne, it'll be an interesting one because he was outstanding this year in his first season with Liam Cohen. But does Jacksonville give him the bag? Does Jacksonville franchise tag him? Which way do you think the Jaguars go here? This is an organization where I'm really not sure because we don't have a large sample size of what they've done recently with this new leadership. This past year, they drafted Bashal Tutin. They also drafted LaQuint Allen in the same draft class, both on day 3. Tutin was a player organizationally they were very excited about, but ultimately Etienne dominated production and touches. What way do you think Jacksonville goes here? Bringing back Etienne, or do you think that there's a new face in the backfield?
I think they're going to bring back Etienne. And again, some of these are the boring answers that I think people don't want to hear. But Travis Etienne and Trevor Lawrence, they've been connected since 2018 when they won a national championship together at Clemson. And that was so much of the talk when they drafted Travis Etienne, was reuniting these two guys and the connection that they had together in college. I think that there is something to be said for that Trevor Lawrence having Etienne there just alongside him in the backfield gives him a sense of comfort. He knows that he can trust him as a check down option. And I think it's been pretty integral for his development. So I like Bashal Tutin. I think LaQuint Allen has a lot of the same traits as Travis Etienne and could end up being that guy. But I can't help but think about the human factor here, the friendship between these two, how long they have played together. I don't think Travis Etienne wants to leave Jacksonville. I don't think Trevor Lawrence wants him to leave Jacksonville as well. So this might be one of those where, looking 100% at the money, it might not make a ton of sense, but I think some things are bigger than money here, and I think they want to keep these two together.
Yeah, I think it's a great point you made about Travis Etienne, and I think ultimately he wants to remain a Jaguar. It's the franchise that drafted him inside of the first round, playing with his college teammate, and also the fact that he was so good in this offense with Liam Cohen in year 1. I do think ultimately, though, there's going to be a significant market for Etienne, especially with the production he had this season. And I think he could end up getting more money on the open market than maybe we would see Jacksonville spend on him. And I'm not sure they're going to go with a franchise tag for Etienne here. For me, I think Jacksonville, ultimately, this decision probably comes down to how much value does the organization put on Bashal Tutin and LaQuint Allen? And is there a situation where they become a little bit more of a committee backfield and they say, we can do it a little bit cheaper than we would bringing back Etienne. Let's give Tutin more touches. Let's give Allen more touches. And let's bring in another back. And I'll throw out an interesting back to you. A player that I think has earned himself a lot of money and a player that I think that the marketplace is going to like. Tyler Allgeier of Atlanta, who found a way to get himself high-value touches like goal line touches, receptions out of the backfield, despite the presence of Bijan Robinson, and he did it with multiple offensive coordinators. It wasn't just like a single coordinator who liked Allgeier. Tyler Allgeier also has a 1,000 rushing yard season under his belt during his rookie season way back in the day under Arthur Smith. I think Allgeier is going to cash out, get paid, get himself a larger opportunity than he would behind maybe the number 1 overall pick in fantasy, Bijan Robinson, this year. Allgeier signs with Jacksonville. They get a little younger and a little cheaper at the running back position, and Allgeier combines with Bashal Tutin in like a fun committee with LaQuint Allen as a specialist receiver out of the backfield. Your thoughts on that one?
I think that would make a ton of sense. And, we talk about the depth of this free agent class. We talked about the big three ad nauseum already on this show, but there's also Rachaad White and Tyler Allgeier, who you just mentioned, and Jerome Ford, Javonte Williams, J.K. Dobbins. I mean, there is going to be no shortage of available running backs. So I think that makes a lot of sense as a complementary piece to Bashal Tutin. I could potentially see that happening. There's another team that I think just screams Tyler Allgeier that I expect to see him sign with this offseason. But again, surprising things happen all the time. I think that could make a lot of sense in Jacksonville.
Yeah, keep that one in the back pocket. We're going to talk about that landing spot a little bit later. Let's pivot over to the wide receiver position. We talked about New England and Buffalo, and those are the low-hanging fruit ones because we've got the elite quarterback and the need of another wide receiver, probably a little bit more so in Buffalo than New England, but those are easy low-hanging fruit ones. Here's a couple of interesting ones, though. Tennessee, who has a quarterback clarity with Cam Ward heading into year 2. Cam Ward did enough at the end that I think if a big name ends up there and we project them for strong target volume, the market could end up really liking a player here because, again, it's the opportunity for targets to be the clear alpha. It's right there. Which way do you think Tennessee goes? And I'll say for Tennessee, they're interesting because Tennessee picks inside the top 5 in the NFL draft and a ton of cap space. So they could really do whatever they want this offseason.
Yeah, I think Carnell Tate makes a lot of sense. Like, they have really shown that they like these big-bodied receivers, and they don't shy away from spending draft capital on receivers as well. So last year they took this very frustrating, quantity over quality approach where they went into training camp with 12 wide receivers, and it was a mix of day 3 picks and undrafted free agents and veterans, and they just kind of tried to patchwork this wide receiver room together. But if you want a quarterback to develop, you need to have that go-to guy that they can rely on. And we've seen this for almost every single quarterback who has taken a huge step forward going into year 2 or year 3 of their contract. It's always when they get this reliable receiver. So to me, Carnell Tate feels like that guy that can go up and come down with contested catches, a guy who doesn't need to get separation on an island. He can get the trust of Cam Ward. And I think that is the number one priority this year. You can't go into year 2 with Alec Pierce and Shamir Dike as the top 2 receivers. Now, I think those guys are much better than their day 3 draft capital implies, but they still have a limit on what they can do in the NFL. And I think bringing in a guy like Carnell Tate to be that bona fide wide receiver 1 just even helps some of the secondary receivers move into better situations. It is one of the most glaring needs when I look at the first round of the NFL draft. And I think it would just be malpractice for the Titans not to take one of these big receivers early in the draft.
Yeah, so Brett Whitefield and I have been very, very high on Carnell Tate. We've been projecting him to go inside this sort of top 8 range in the NFL draft over and over again. There was a little bit of pushback when we first did it, Dave, saying, Carnell Tate might not be your classic number 4 overall pick type wideout. But I would push back that I think he's really NFL ready and fantasy friendly. A lot of squint and looks like AJ Green type tape out there for him. Great catch radius, ability to make plays downfield, very athletic, and just happens to play with a player that might be the number 1 pick in 2027 in Jeremiah Smith. So, Carnell Tate's a great one. I actually think this is going to be, hey, we've got Cam Ward here. Let's do what we can to supercharge this rebuild. I think they're going to take advantage in both the free agent market and in the NFL draft. I think Carnell Tate in round 1. And I think they also signed Wan'Dale Robinson, a player who's had 140 targets in consecutive years. Does this hurt Shamir Dike in the slot? Absolutely. But like you said, I don't think that NFL teams care about this as much as maybe we do. And when it comes to Chim Dike, we're talking about a player who's one of the best return men that we've seen come into the league in quite some time. So I think that the value that Dike presents to Tennessee is a lot of it's going to be on the special teams side than, hey, we need to maximize him as a wide receiver. Wan'Dale Robinson getting into Tennessee, again, you get that young veteran. We talked about it with Alec Pierce. The market for Wan'Dale is going to be strong. And when you talk about Wan'Dale and you talk about Alec Pierce, they're both former second-round draft picks in the NFL draft. So they've got the pedigree, they've got the youth, they've got the production. I think Tennessee does it both ways here, Wan'Dale and Carnell Tate. And if they can trade down and get Carnell Tate at 7 or 8 overall, I think they'll do it. But the market for trade downs, Brett Whitefield, I brought this up to Brett, and Brett talked about the lack of clarity and how it's really a larger tier of sort of elite players in this year's NFL draft. There might be fewer trade down opportunities for teams towards the very top that we've seen in most years.
Yeah, and you talk about the potential overlap between Wan'Dale Robinson and Jameer DK. They both do prefer to play out of the slot, but they're very different types of slot players. Wan'Dale Robinson is more of your shifty route runner, getting open underneath and creating after the catch, where DK is more of a field stretching, like once you use that straight line speed to get behind defenses. And when you have that type of slot player, he can live out of the slot, but they could also kick him out to flanker as well. So you can play with both of them on the field at the same time. You also talk about the punt return abilities that are going to keep him active on the team as well. So that would make a lot of sense. I think Wan'Dale Robinson is one of the forgotten guys in this draft class, but you look at the connection that Cam Ward and Xavier Restrepo had during their time together in Miami. Wan'Dale Robinson can do everything Xavier Restrepo can do, and arguably do it better. He's just a faster, more dynamic type of player. So I think that was one of the major things that was missing from the Titans offense this year, was a guy who could just get open immediately off the line of scrimmage and be that underneath outlet receiver. We kind of saw it from Tajay Spears late in the season, but Wan'Dale Robinson in Tennessee would make so much sense. I think they wanted that from Tyler Lockett, and he just isn't the player that he used to be. So go get somebody a little bit younger, a guy who's coming off of a good season. Wan'Dale Robinson would make so much sense.
Yeah, no, I think Wan'Dale, we talked about this on your pod. Alec Pierce, Wan'Dale Robinson, both of these guys are going to get a ton of money in the open market, maybe more money than the average NFL fan or fantasy football manager is anticipating. Youth matters here. Let's talk about the Cleveland Browns. And unlike Tennessee, we have no idea who the quarterback will be. Maybe it's going to be Shedeur Sanders. Maybe they're going to bring in a Malik Willis to compete with him, a player of that ilk. The NFL draft, it's almost assuredly not going to use the number 6 overall pick on a quarterback. It's going to go elsewhere. But they have a huge glaring need at the wide receiver 1 in Cleveland. Harold Fannin Jr. led Cleveland in everything this year. Targets, touchdown catches, receiving yards, and he did it as a 21-year-old tight end. Now, I love Harold Fannin. I know you like him a lot too, but they need to get some help at the skill position players for whoever is behind center next year and for this new coaching staff to get a head start. What way do you think they'll address the wide receiver position?
I think they're going here in the draft. This isn't the strongest free agent class for wide receivers, and it rarely is. Like, we don't see good, talented wide receivers in their prime hitting the free market all that often. Like, when a player or when a team drafts a good wide receiver, they want to retain him. So, there isn't like a game-changing wide receiver that's going to be available this year. And that's why we talk about Alec Pierce and Wan'Dale Robinson. I don't want to besmirch their names by any means, but they're probably better as wide receiver 2s on a team than they are as wide receiver 1s. And those are probably the guys highlighting this free agent class. So again, I look at the NFL draft, I see Jordan Tyson sitting there with the Browns picking early, sitting at 6th overall. Jordan Tyson, again, you kind of said the same thing about Carnell Tate. These guys might not feel like your prototypical top 5, top 8 picks in the NFL draft, but this is a very weak draft class, especially with the quarterbacks that typically get steamed up into the top 10. I think Fernando Mendoza is going to be the only the only quarterback drafted inside the top 10. So that's going to force some of these other premium positions like wide receivers up the board. And Jordan Tyson, a very, very good wide receiver. I think in a lot of other draft classes, he probably would have fallen into the 15 or 20 range, but given the needs at the top of the draft, given the lack of other premium positions available, I think Jordan Tyson going to the Browns makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think Tyson, a lot of it's going to come down to the guy's had a number of injuries. It's how do the NFL teams value those? A lot of them are unrelated, but it's like the multitude of them. So I think the fact that they're not overlapping injuries probably is a benefit to him. But do NFL teams see him as sort of a quote-unquote injury-prone type guy? I know people hate that term, Dave, but the tape for Jordan Tyson is nasty. Jordan Tyson is awesome. I think he's a locked-in first-round pick, probably somewhere inside of the top 15 or so selections, maybe inside the top 20 if he does slip a little bit, but he could go as high as like 4 or 5. He's really, really good. So that would be a really, really strong answer there. For me, I think Cleveland can wait a little bit with this wide receiver class. They have 2 first-round picks. So if we remember last year, they acquired Jacksonville's pick in the Travis Hunter deal. So they pick at 24 overall. I think they could go a little bit cheaper at wide receiver than using 6 overall. 6 overall, they could take maybe the best offensive lineman, and they really need that there. They have 2 starting interior linemen that are both over 30 years old, and both also could be gone this year. They need to get better on the O-line. They could use 6 there. They could add an impact defender at 6 overall. Last year's draft class, they were able to add some youth early on the defensive side of the ball. Maybe they do that again. But with their second first-round pick, I'm going to look at a player that I think is going to gain exceptional value at the Senior Bowl, and that's KC Concepcion, really talented player at Texas A&M by way of NC State. Was excellent at NC State, transfers to A&M, was the focal point for the A&M offense, especially in the passing game. Really, really fun talent. Also is used on manufactured running attempts this year for A&M. Concepcion, I think, has a little bit of, and I used the Zay Flowers comparison, and Brett Whitefield thinks he's going to be way, way better than Zay Flowers. So Brett's already all over this one. Again, whispering words like Amon-Ra St. Brown in some of the ways you could use them here. I think KC Concepcion ends up being a top 25 pick and a really, really good one. He could rise up into like the Egbuka level, get inside that top 20 picks as well if he has a strong offseason. I think teams are going to really like him.
Yeah, I love the Zay Flowers comp. I said Luther Burden is what I saw in his game. I mean,
That's
just
a
very good wide receiver. And I don't know, like they have so many needs right now. Like you said, Harold Fannin, who like great rookie season. You don't want to take that away from him, but like they can go multiple different directions if they want to go that KC Concepcion route and get that gadgety kind of slot player that can create after the catch. They can do that, but they could also go for a Denzel Boston type of player, or a guy who can make plays downfield, and a guy who has the straight line speed and physicality. I mean, there isn't a glaring need here. So often we're looking for a team that like they already have their wide receiver one and they're looking for a complementary piece next to him. But I think the Browns, if they do want to wait until 24 and they don't want to pay up for a Jordan Tyson or Carnell Tate, I mean, there are going to be a lot of good players available at that pick 24. So I think either of those guys make sense, but KC Concepcion, so much fun. And I always love those guys that kind of project for late first round draft capital because they end up falling into good situations with good quarterbacks, teams that are picking late. So if KC Concepcion does fall late into the first and end up with the Browns, it would crush my soul just a little bit.
Yeah, love that take. All right, Dave, we're going to end the show. We're going to go a little quicker on these ones. Let's talk about the wide receiver that maybe people are not anticipating is something splashy this offseason, but the Las Vegas Raiders, they trade Jacoby Myers, and now they have a ton of cap space. They have a huge hole at the wide receiver position. What way do you think that they go?
I mean, Alec Pierce makes a ton of sense just because we know the Raiders love speed and they have money to blow. But I think this is one where they're just kind of content to build around Brock Bowers and make him the focal point of the passing attack. Jack Bech, we didn't see a lot from last year until late in the season when Jacoby Myers was gone, but I still have faith in Jack Bech developing into a good NFL talent. Trey Tucker, is that perfect complementary receiver to Jack Bech. He took a big step forward last year as well. So my boring answer here is that they are probably just going to end up sticking with the wide receivers that they have. They also spent that pick on Dante Thornton, another rookie wide receiver. So they've got a lot of these young receivers that they can rotate through while building around Brock Bowers. And I think one of the, I've talked about Kyler Murray potentially getting traded. I think the Raiders would make a lot of sense. A splashy name that would get people excited. They've got the money to blow to take on that contract, and they can drop Kyler Murray into a situation where he'd have a decent slew of pass catchers around him.
Yeah, I think that the Murray or a bridge quarterback comes down to who does Vegas value? Do they value Fernando Mendoza at the 101, which I think ultimately we talk about, like in most drafts, would Fernando Mendoza be the number one pick? I don't think so, but I think for this particular draft, it's a perfect situation because Vegas is desperate for QB, and they don't have to trade any additional picks. They just stay on the clock. They use the number one overall pick. They take Fernando Mendoza, and maybe he ends up being a top 15 quarterback in the NFL, which would be a huge bonus for them to get. If you draft Mendoza, I think it influences this pick because you want to really surround this player with a great offensive ecosystem that's going to maximize them. Now, Vegas needs a lot. They need a lot of offensive line help as well. But I think ultimately, if you draft Mendoza, you have the second round pick. Could you fill your wide receiver one with a player like Elijah Surratt, the Indiana wide receiver who's played so well this season? He's a Senior Bowl invite, but probably won't go there because he's in the national title game. But you could get Fernando Mendoza, his number one target from Indiana. I know there's a lot of people at Fantasy Points that are very high on Surratt. I like him a lot as well. But you could get him staying on the clock, using that 36 overall pick on Surratt, number 1 overall pick on Mendoza. You get the teammates from Indiana. You plug them right in there. And Tucker can coexist with him quite well. Jack Besh can coexist with him quite well. So they have a chance to sort of moneyball the wide receiver position through the draft. All 3 of those guys are players the organization drafted on day 2. They'll continue that streak. They'll go with Surratt.
And I know you said you wanted to go rapid fire, but I'm going to go off script
No,
for
go.
just a minute here.
We can't really go rapid fire. We'll go rapid fire as we can.
Raiders, Jets, Cardinals. That's 1, 2, and 3 right now. Do you expect that to be the 1, 2, and 3 come draft day? Because I could see this being one of those situations where there's one quarterback and 3 quarterback needy teams. One of them has a quarterback that they've made it pretty apparent that they want to trade. It wouldn't surprise me if we see the Cardinals, trade with the Raiders, where the Raiders take on Kyler Murray and they jump up to 1 and they take Fernando Mendoza, or perhaps the Jets wanted to move up. So when I look at these 3 teams, I just keep having this thought in the back of my mind that, yeah, we're seeing this as 1, 2, 3 right now, but I don't expect that to be the case by the time the NFL draft gets here.
Yeah, I think that it's an interesting one. I think ultimately Vegas stays on the clock and uses the number 1 overall pick. I think that the Jets and the Cardinals would both be very open towards moving down. If Arizona falls in love with one of the offensive linemen that should go inside the top 10, I think they stand pat. And then number 2, the Jets, they feel like a team with the way that they were acquiring draft picks around the trade deadline. I think that that's the way that this front office wants to go. They want to win through the draft. They want to add a lot of picks, and maybe the cost to move up to 2 down to from like 7 or 8 or 9 is cheaper than in most years with a little bit more of a flatter tier. But if the Jets can pick up another pick that they like to make that move, I think they're open to it. So I think ultimately, Dave, the bet would be that there is probably a trade inside the top 3, but I think ultimately Vegas stays pat at 1, and it's Arizona or the Jets moving down. So we got so much to do before the NFL draft. Right. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to be talking about that at length. Nice professional segue. Make sure you're checking out the 2026 NFL Draft Podcast, dropping that once a week with Brett Whitefield. Subscribe to it anywhere you can get your podcasts. Let's actually try to go rapid fire on this one. Commanders running back position. Do they stick with Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt leading the backfield, or do they sign someone else and maybe try to elevate the position? Krosky-Merritt had 8 touchdowns and 800 rushing yards. Didn't necessarily feel like it. Which way do you think this team goes at running back?
I think Tyler Allgeier makes so much sense here. Just a hard-nosed running back. We know that's exactly what Dan Quinn wants in this offense. Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt is more of the dancing around, scat back, get out there in space, make people miss. But I think that going from Chris Rodriguez as that early down guy, upgrading to Tyler Allgeier would just be a huge improvement in this offense. To me, that's one that I have, you can't have any confidence in any of these situations because we don't know how things are going to play out. But I really think that Tyler Allgeier in a Washington Commanders uniform just makes too much sense.
And I'll say that they sign a free agent running back, but I'll say they stay in the division. I think that this is the landing spot for Javonte Williams, where you've seen this many times, Dave, where team players sign within the division. It's a little bit more familiarity. Again, Williams only a Cowboy for 1 year, but he's young enough. He's got a large enough sample size. I think he would fit in quite well next to Jaden Daniels. And you talk about his receiving ability, where we saw Austin Eckler thrive with that receiving role there. Keep an eye on Javonte Williams becoming a Washington Commander. Also, if they want to go a little cheaper here, Rachaad White wants to play with Jaden Daniels. That was his teammate at Arizona State. Apparently, there's been some speculation by beat reporters in Washington that Rachaad White could end up being a Commander and also really kind of fit in with Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt there. So I'll say Javonte Williams, you'll say Tyler Allgeier, and I'll throw Rachaad White's name into the universe. Let's also talk about the Washington tight end position. This is an underrated one. Deebo Samuel is going to be a free agent this year at the wide receiver position. He had a very strong year in Washington. Be interesting to see if Washington, who needs to get younger, doesn't move off of Deebo this year. I think that's up in the air. It depends on sort of what Deebo gets on the open market. Then you talk about Zach Ertz, who looks like a player who might retire. Big injury to end the year when you factor in his age. Looks like a player that might be done. Don't want to speculate if he's actually trying to make a comeback, but it feels like it. And then you talk about Jaden Daniels, who's had a propensity to target the tight end. A lot of that's reflective of Cliff Kingsbury's scheme and Ertz being there, but it just seems like that's something that's helped Daniels. So the tight end position in Washington, what way do you think they could go?
spent a second round pick on Ben Sinnott 2 years ago, and I know that he has not been good so far. And it's we can kind of like tongue in cheek make the comp to Trey McBride, who did like next to nothing playing in the shadow of Zach Ertz. But we saw Zach Ertz go down, and Ben Sinnott still didn't really step up. We saw a little mix of John Bates, but we don't see teams give up on guys who were drafted in round 1 and round 2 after just 2 years that frequently. So I think that this job is Ben Sinnott's to lose. And maybe this is just me coping with all of the, round 2 and round 3 rookie picks that I spent on Ben Sinnott a couple of years ago. But I still think, this is a talented young player, really good athleticism. He profiles as a pass catching running back. I'd hope that the job is his to lose week 1 and that we can finally see him get a little bit more involved despite almost nothing for his first 2 seasons.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting. Ben Sinnott, they used him more as like a fullback, H-back type.
Yeah.
Do they look at him as a player that can expand his role? I'm not sure. And I also think when you look at the cap space they have, they can make a splashy move. Now, you mentioned that the wide receiver position has limited names. I've said that I think Washington will be involved with guys like Robinson, guys like Pierce, because they have the cap space for it. But I think ultimately, this seems like a Kyle Pitts type landing spot. Kyle Pitts is still very young. You talk about a tight end who could absorb a lot of targets, and you talk about a way to give Jaden Daniels strong pass-catching weapons around him. Kyle Pitts, of course, was extremely highly drafted, had a huge year this year when it all came down to it, benefited to Drake London's injury, but he still produced at a very high rate. I think Kyle Pitts could ultimately end up being a Washington Commander.
I think I would love that. And, just putting Kyle Pitts and that role that we have seen be so lucrative for so many other tight ends in in Cliff Kingsbury's system, would love it. And still like just turned 25 years old. Like, I feel like it's the Amari Cooper thing where like every year we're just like in awe at how young he was. Like, it's crazy that Kyle Pitts has been in the league for this long and still just turned 25.
Let's talk about the Houston Texans running back situation. We talked about this on your show. They've had a model here where they've drafted guys on day 3, like Dameon Pierce and Woody Marks. And Woody Marks, they got a lot out of this year. I think there's a lot of Woody Marks dynasty managers who don't enjoy us having this conversation right now. But they've also been like the transfer portal team in the NFL, where they've brought in guys like Joe Mixon, Devin Singletary, Nick Chubb this year, and then years ago, the David Johnson signing from Arizona. What way do you think Houston handles their running back position this offseason?
Yeah, like you said, they love going to the transfer portal. They love these injured, over-the-hill running backs, and Najee Harris fits the bill. To me, Najee Harris feels like such a Houston Texan, and they'll mix him in with Woody Marks. We know it's like a decent offensive line, and it's a good offense, and we keep like wish casting a good receiver to end up there. But like you said, Nick Chubb last year, Joe Mixon the year before, Devin Singletary the year before that. They like taking these guys with pedigree who are coming off of injuries that have some concern. So to me, Najee Harris checks all of those boxes. I think it would make a lot of sense if they just keep on that track for them to bring in Najee.
I made this prediction a while ago. I made it like maybe a month ago. I think this ultimately ends up being the Breece Hall spot. It's a team that's close enough to a title. And you talk about bringing in these transfer portal type running backs. Of course, we're talking about free agents, not transfer portal. Just it's fun. Breece Hall, though, 24 years old. I think it gives them the opportunity to add a player that's really just better than Woody Marks, and he's younger than Woody Marks. Woody Marks is actually a little bit older than Breece Hall here. I might be off on that. They might be, but they're close enough within a couple of months of one another. Breece Hall, I think this could be the stability that we've been looking for. And actually, Woody Marks makes a lot of sense as like a change of pace back, a backup to Breece Hall, because he can do a lot of the same things stylistically. So I think Breece Hall really helps CJ Stroud because of his receiving ability. Has been very, very unfortunate in terms of the offensive ecosystem around him in New York. I think he gets to Houston on a really good team and has a chance to really take off. And I think the second arc of his career could look better than the first.
I would love that. That would be a lot of fun.
You've got a fun one with your Chicago Bears, a team that I didn't even really think about for this process, but you have some ideas here.
Yeah, when I look at the Chicago Bears, Ben Johnson specifically, like he has worked with a lot of different running back duos, but they all kind of have the same thing where it's this, thunder and lightning type of approach. And we saw Ben Johnson's first year as an offensive coordinator. He got good success from DeAndre Swift and Jamal Williams, and everyone thought they were just going to run it back next year. And they went out the next offseason and they spent a bunch of money on David Montgomery, and then they spent a top 10 pick on Jahmyr Gibbs. So I think that he's gotten decent production from DeAndre Swift and from Kyle Monangai this year. But when you look at the way that DeAndre Swift's contract is structured, it was very much so a 2-year deal with a team option. They can save almost $8 million by releasing DeAndre Swift this offseason. So I think they released DeAndre Swift. I think they're happy with what they got from Monangai, a round 7 pick who was able to be serviceable over the second half of the season. But I think that pairing Monangai up, this hard-nosed, physical, downhill runner, you want to pair him up with a Jahmyr Gibbs, DeAndre Swift type of player, and Kenneth Walker makes so much sense to me. This is a team that I think they want to invest in firepower at the running back position. I think DeAndre Swift gets released, and Kenneth Walker comes in to be that RB1A alongside Kyle Monangai.
The fantasy community would be head over heels by that sort of a landing spot. Also, Monangai is a player that I think there's going to be some apprehension on the market. Despite him looking really good this year, people are going to gravitate back towards the fact that he was an opportunistic player for Chicago this year. He was a 7th-round pick. If you have Kenneth Walker there, I think the market's going to really gravitate towards, wow, he could be even better than DeAndre Swift in this offense. So that's an exciting one. I'll say the New Orleans Saints are also an interesting one. You've brought up the merits of rostering Devin Neal, and I thought that was an interesting take. But ultimately, it feels like a team that could also choose to do something splashy. Now, we're not going to talk about free agents here because the Saints are never in good cap space. But which way do you think that they're going to handle this running back position? Again, Alvin Kamara heading towards 32 years old.
Yeah, I don't want to spoil your take, but I love the take that you dropped on my show yesterday about where they go with the running back position.
You know what, Dave? It's now our take. We're sharing this take this offseason.
Let's hear it. So Jeremiah Love is what you said, and I think that would make so much sense. Like, it's exactly what this offense needs. But when I look at the books, they're not saving any money by releasing Alvin Kamara. So unless Alvin Kamara just chooses to turn his back on $18 million and retire, they've got a lot of running back money on the books. So I do like the idea of Jeremiah Love, but throwing him into a backfield where I expect Alvin Kamara to still be there, I expect Devin Neal to still be there. I don't know how it would work out. I think long-term, there's a lot of excitement there, but I still think, even though there are a lot of rumors about the Saints releasing Alvin Kamara, I just don't see how they do that and willingly eat that $18 million in dead cap.
Yeah, I'll say Jeremiah Love, if he's there on the board when New Orleans is picking, I think they're pulling the trigger. I think they're taking him. You talk about Bijan Robinson playing indoors, Jahmyr Gibbs playing indoors, Jeremiah Love ends up playing indoors. Sort of these top 10 running backs landing in really good situations. And with New Orleans, it's an opportunity where Chris Olave dominates the target share, but Jeremiah Love could step in and be sort of a co-offensive focal point. You could see him really, really thrive. And again, playing indoors, electric type player for the New Orleans Saints there. And I think Kellen Moore has a great track record here of maximizing his offensive skill position talent. Jeremiah Love ends up being a New Orleans Saint. We're talking about taking him at somewhere inside the top 15 overall. Might end up being a 1-2 turn type pick by the time we get to real redraft season. Let's go real rapid fire here, Dave. Let's talk about a couple under the radar landing spots here. Dolphins secondary pass catcher. They have Jalen Waddle, they have Devon Etienne, and then they have glaring holes at wide receiver and tight end. Who do you think could end up here?
It's so hard to guess because we don't know who the coach is going to be. But to me, Christian Kirk, we have seen him just being a journeyman, bouncing around on a different team seemingly every single year these last few seasons. I think he would make a lot of sense there. Jalen Waddle could be the clear wide receiver 1, but Christian Kirk is one of the better wide receiver 2s in the league. There's a lot of overlapping skill sets, catching the ball across the middle of the field and things like that. But Christian Kirk, to me, seems like he would be a good secondary receiver alongside Waddle.
And I'll say that there's 2 players I think they could select at 11 overall that both would be in skill position players. I'll say Kenyon Sadiq, the tight end from Oregon, wouldn't steam up in ADP. He's a profile that I think a lot of fantasy managers might not like as much as NFL players when you get to the raw metrics. He's also 20 years old, but he'd be a fantastic fit in Miami next year as a rookie tight end. But the player that I think ultimately does gain a lot of ADP value, you talk about Jalen Waddle, but they have a clear lack of pass catchers around Waddle. I think ultimately Jordan Tyson falls to 11 overall. Miami pulls the trigger. Jordan Tyson is a Miami Dolphin. So you've got Tyson and Waddle coexisting. And eventually when Waddle ages out or they move off of Waddle, then Tyson takes over the wide receiver 1 there in Miami. It makes a lot of sense. Here's a fun one for you and a little bit under the radar. Atlanta Falcons, who could end up being Clint Kubiak's destination. There's been a little speculation there recently. I think the dominoes are all going to start to fall with these head coaches after Harbaugh to the New York Giants. But secondary pass catcher, let's say Kyle Pitts leaves. You now have a void at tight end and wide receiver. What way do you think Atlanta could go here?
Well, I don't expect Kyle Pitts to leave it. I know so many people want to see him out of there, but I think that, after spending the 4th overall pick on him, finally seeing him break out over the second half of the season, I think that they would retain him. If Clint Kubiak does go there, I think, wheels up for Drake London. We have seen Clint Kubiak just turn like every single top receiver in his offense into a very, very viable, elite fantasy wide receiver 1. As for a secondary pass catcher, I don't know. I think right now what they have with Darnell Mooney kind of being that wide receiver 2, very opposite skill set of what Drake London brings to the table. It makes sense. And I want to speculate on this, but I really think that they're just going to end up retaining Kyle Pitts. I think Darnell Mooney walks in free agency. They try to patch that wide receiver 2 spot with a day 3 receiver. But I think we're going to see a few more years of Drake London and Kyle Pitts being the top 2 weapons in Atlanta.
I'll say if it is Kubiak in Atlanta, keep an eye on Rashid Shaheed, who Seattle wants to retain, but he's going to be a free agent. You talk about maybe this is just Rashid Shaheed goes where Clint Kubiak goes. And if there's no Kyle Pitts there, that would be a really dynamic combination between London, the mega target earner, and Shaheed, a guy who's electric, can make plays downfield. I think people get really excited about that one. I think Atlanta fans would love that one. So keep an eye on that one. But yeah, I think Mooney, Pitts, London being back in Atlanta, that might just be your trio with Bijan Robinson dominated touchings out of the backfield as well. Be really exciting.
If Clint Kubiak is the head coach, this is like blasphemous to say right now, but I wouldn't be all that surprised if Kirk Cousins ends up being the week 1 starter over Michael Penix just because of the history that they have together.
You turn this into a hot takes show. That's a hot take right there, Dave. I love that one. And we'll finish this one out. 130 plus targets for Keenan Allen. Do we think that LA, who has an exceptional amount of cap space, I believe they have the most cap space of any team this offseason, or they're right in the top 2. Does LA do
million
something?
$110 million.
So they could do anything. So we talked about like AJ Brown trade destinations. It could be the LA Chargers, but does LA value the Quentin Johnston, Trey Harris, Ladd McConkey, Oronde Gadsden pass catching foursome like enough that it would preclude them from doing something splashy at the receiver position?
Frankly, I think they made a mistake by bringing Keenan Allen back this year, and he looked good to start the season, but having Keenan Allen on the field meant fewer opportunities for the young, talented guys that they're trying to develop. So, sure, they have the money. They can go blow it all on Alec Pierce and Wan'Dale Robinson and Breece Hall if they want to, but I think that they need to look at the young pieces that they have there in Ladd McConkey, Quentin Johnston, Oronde Gadsden, Trey Harris. They've invested serious draft capital into these guys over the last couple of years, and they all, outside of, that first month of the season from Quentin Johnston, they all kind of took a step back, and that's not what you want to see for guys that you have invested in. So I think they're going to take a long-term approach this year. They'll probably spend money on the defense, which was pretty terrible. Luckily, they've got their bookend tackles coming back, but they might try to fortify that interior offensive line a little bit in free agency. But I think that we will probably see Ladd McConkey, Oronde Gadsden, Trey Harris, and Quentin Johnston being the 4 pass catchers there. And I don't know if they're going to add anybody else to that mix.
Yeah, I think you're probably right about that one. And it's a real opportunity for these players to absorb that target share. LA is also going to have a new offensive coordinator. We don't know what that's going to look like. Marion Hampton's going to take on a much larger role next year, but definitely a team that is a major wild card for this offseason. Because of the cap space, they can really do anything they want. And Dave, if a couple other players become sort of available on that open market that we're maybe not speculating about, I think LA could get involved in any trade they want as well with this sort of cap space flexibility. We covered a ton. We went way too long. Let everybody know once again where they can find your work.
Yeah, real easy, footballguys.com. Everything I've got is going over there besides these guy shows that I get to do with Theo every now and then.
Yeah. Back-to-back days, Dave. Back-to-back days. Unbelievably good time.
Often. It's fun.
Yeah, highly recommend all of Dave's work. It's absolute fire over there at Football Guys. We've had a number of your colleagues over in the mix here. Love mixing it up with guys like you and Sigmund Bloom. Make sure you stick with Fantasy Football Daily. We've got you covered all offseason long. Hey, less than 2 months away from the start of NFL free agency. We've got you covered for that one, plus all these trades coming up. Oh, and we've got to talk about the rest of the NFL playoffs. Make sure you check out Dynasty Life this week. Subscribe to that on the Dynasty Life podcast feed. Ryan, Heath, and I discuss our Dynasty rankings updates, and you're going to find that one on our new YouTube channel, Fantasy Points Dynasty. So put in Fantasy Points Dynasty. All of my Dynasty Life content is going over to the new Dynasty YouTube channel. Make sure you check that one out. We'll see you soon.